Was Baldwin right that life is about connection to others? Or was Sartre right that ultimately we only have our own experience? Hello and welcome. We take it for granted that through language and communication, we can learn about the experience of others. But it remains unknown whether we can fully know what it's like to be another human being. James Baldwin and Jean-Paul Sartre take radically different approaches. For Sartre, the experience of others is unknown to us. Fundamentally, we are alone with our own subjectivity. While for Baldwin, quote, to encounter oneself is to encounter the other, and this is love, end quote. Summing up his disagreement with Sartre, he remarked, quote again, "It has always seemed to me that ideas were somewhat more real than people." Well, was Baldwin right that to be alive is to be socially connected to others? Or is Sartre's insight that the only thing we can know is our own experience more telling? Should we conclude that we cannot understand the experience of another unless we've had the same experience? Or is language capable of bridging that seemingly impossible gap between us? Well, we have a wonderful panel here today to answer those and many other questions beyond them. Jonathan Webber is a philosopher based at Cardiff University. He's president of the UK Sartre Society, trustee of the Mind Association, and author of the book Rethinking Existentialism. Marie-Elsa Bragg is a teacher, priest, and author of 2 novels. Her work has also appeared in The Telegraph and The Church Times. And Joanna Kavenna is an author, writer, travel writer, and winner of the Orange First Novel Prize, and her novels include Z, The Ice Museum, and Inglorious. We please welcome them all here today. So I'm going to start, as is now traditional, with the festival in asking each of our speakers to give us up to 3 minutes of a pitch on the question that drives us through today's discussion. Was Baldwin right that life is about connection to others? Or was Sartre right that ultimately we only have our own experience? Jonathan, could we turn to you?
Thank you. So I've been working on Sartre for 25, 30 years. But when I was invited to do this talk, at that point, I knew very little about James Baldwin. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading a lot of his essays over the last 6 weeks or so. But one thing that I found quite striking is, contrary to the way this debate is set up, I'm afraid, I actually think that Baldwin has an awful lot in common with Sartre. Baldwin is a great writer, and one of the things that's great about him is that he doesn't wear his influences on his sleeve. He doesn't make heavy weather of footnotes and citations and so on and so forth. So it's difficult to see who his influences are. But where he ends up with his general kind of perspective on human existence strikes me as remarkably existentialist, right? So I think what they have in common is, I think, 2 aspects that are really important for this discussion. One is the thought that social meanings that sort of structure our environment and structure our experience also then come to shape our own kind of characters and our own outlook and our own experience of the world and our own take on the world through our engagement with those social meanings, through our education and upbringing, but also through our ongoing attempts to navigate the social world, which is structured that way. I think they have that in common. I think they also both think that ultimately we're not determined by that stuff. It shapes what we do and it can shape our outlook, but ultimately we're driven by the goals that we set for ourselves, and we have the freedom to think about those goals, to decide on those goals, and even, therefore, to take it as a goal, to oppose some of those social meanings that we're found in our environment, to try to change our environments, but also to kind of erode the influence that they have on the way that we ourselves think. I think both Sartre and Baldwin think that, and I think that they both emphasize that quite strongly. So what does that mean for limitations on understanding other people? Well, look, we don't all have the same experience of social meanings and social society. We grow up in different regions of it. We experience and we grow up in different positions in it. So we don't all have the same experience. So the meanings that are structuring your experience are not exactly the same as the ones that are structuring my experience, even though they're coming from our collective society, because we've just taken different paths through that environment. And they both make that point quite strongly in different ways. The second point, and I think Sartre emphasizes this much more than Baldwin, but it does follow from what they both think, is that if a person's experience of the world is structured by their own goals, their purposes, what it is they're striving to pursue, of course, you never quite know what the other person's goals and purposes and aims are. So you never quite know how they are experiencing or see the situation that you're both in. Sartre dramatizes this by saying it's like playing poker, right? You just don't know what the other person's hand is. That follows from what they both think too, and that is then a limitation on the extent to which that you can understand another person's perspective.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan. I think very clearly articulated there the idea through Sartre that you can have an idea of the other, but maybe proper understanding really is going to be a bridge too far. Joanna, Team Sartre, Team Baldwin, where are you going to take us?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to try and I broadly agree with lots of what Jonathan's saying, that they're obviously far more similar than a kind of binary dualist format for the debate might suggest. I mean, I think it's really interesting about language, and I was just thinking as Jonathan was speaking of Sartre when he says we're within language as we're within our bodies, and this sense of what you can do within that system where you're always being defined. And I think Baldwin writes about that brilliantly in his novels. I was thinking of Go Tell It on the Mountain, his 1953 novel, and there's that brilliant bit, John Grimes is growing up in poverty in Harlem, and he goes off to Central Park and he climbs a hill in Central Park and he looks down at the skyline and he thinks, I'm going to claim this city, people are going to throw flowers in my path, I'm going to be amazing, as you do when you're young, he's a teenager. And then he suddenly remembers that actually when the people see him, he says they ignore me, or they just sort of smirk. That's the verb that Baldwin writes. And so that disparity all the time between what you are inside and the way that society contains you in language, categorizes you, perceives you. But then there's an amazing moment. I think Baldwin's brilliant at these moments of connection as well, where as John Grimes is running down the hill, he bumps into an old man, and there's a moment he's shocked and he can't find the words to say sorry for this collision. And then he says, suddenly they smile. The old man smiles at him. He smiles back. And there's a completely non-verbal moment of total connection. And so I think Baldwin's beautifully expressing these strange moments in the midst of all this chaos of being categorized and taxonomized by this language that we haven't chosen, we haven't invented it. There are these strange moments of connection and beauty, and the way he writes about those, I think that's the really brilliant aspect of his writing that I really respond to as well. So I guess I'm probably Team Baldwin if we have to really take sides. But
Take it up with the festival. Take it up with the festival.
Yeah, but why not? Okay, I'm going to go Team Baldwin. Yeah.
Okay. And Marie-Elsa, I mean, again, just a reminder, the key question here is, was Baldwin right that life is about connection to others? Or was Sartre right that ultimately we only really have our own experience? Perhaps it's less about the writers, but more about their ideas. Where would you go with that?
Well, I think they both have a really central and important bid for freedom. And that freedom, both of them want to be able to choose or find a way to free themselves from the societal ideas that they are forced to comply with. I mean, Sartre has that extraordinary description of being on a tram and looking at a seat and it just sort of disappearing, doesn't he? And being able to go into a place where there is nothing but free choice. I think Baldwin also really is talking so much about the way that culture and the book, The Fire Next Time, he really talks about the church and religion, how much that really oppresses us because it tells us how we are. And he wants to make a bid of freedom from that to choice. I wonder if the difference is, though, that if we get to a moment, perhaps just a moment of that choice, that real freedom that they're both talking about, and Baldwin talks about the possibility of that within the Christian tradition, if it hadn't been for the Pauline way, that method that had been taken over the church. If we are able to get to that kernel, is there a unity in it? Is there what Sheldrake would call a morphic resonance? Is there something that helps us, in which we feel the other, or are we then there completely alone? And I suppose I would argue that Baldwin really is pointing towards there being a unity, and that we're always really connected. And he's writing alongside works such as Bert Hellinger's looking at the idea of constellations, and that even with our groups or even with our ancestors, we are always feeling the morphic field, the resonance with each other, and we're always actually connected. And in that system, the more freedom we find to really wake up, the more we're able to be a part of the field and individuated at the same time. And I think they're both trying to do that.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.